This story has been recorded at an Addictive Eaters Anonymous meeting in New Zealand. You can email us at contact@aeanz.org.
Hi, I'm Diana. I'm an addictive eater. Right, just thinking back. Straight away, I have just thought of my first ever memory of trying to get food. And what I remember is I was at a dairy, I was in Invercargill. I couldn't even, the counter was higher than me, and I was trying to steal chewing gum. And that is my very first thing that comes to mind. When I look back at my life, I just immediately think of memories. And I grew up in the South Island of New Zealand, and nearly every Christmas as a child, I would go down to Invercargill where my cousins were, and all those times of my life, like Christmas, I can still remember what I was eating at those times. Like, I remember when cheesels came out, So Christmas would normally be a time of, I guess for most people, like presents and giving and other people, but not for me, So, I had this food obsession in my mind from a very, very young age, and and I was odd around food. I remember we moved to Timaru when I was young, and I remember one of my cousins was staying with us, and often in the street we lived in, Mr. Whippy would go past, and I would go completely crazy, like I just had to have a Mr. Whippy ice cream. And I think my mother knew there was something about me, because she would never, ever let me have one. I remember this one time I did, and, I just almost sculled it. But, like, my mother was a great baker. I couldn't keep away from her baking when she made it. I caused a lot of conflict in my family because one of the things my mother did when I grew up is she would buy, she'd buy a cake of chocolate, say, and I'm talking 7 years old, she would have to hide it. Anything sweet that came into the house, she would have to hide, because I would just hunt it down like prey, I would, that's all I would think of till I found it, and then I would eat it, and I'd generally eat the lot. So she had gone and made a special effort to buy something for the whole family, and I would eat the lot. And my father is Irish, half Irish, and he had a real Irish temper, and he would get so angry with me, because it would have been talked about, oh yeah, this special treat. And my mother would go to the top cupboard, I remember this, she'd go to the top cupboard in the kitchen, and there would be nothing there. And my father would just be furious with me, So there was a lot of screaming and yelling and hitting, and, and I'd be crying my eyes out, and, and so instead of a nice family time, there'd just be all this shenanigans because of me. And so I was just always crazy and weird around food, and even as a young child, I could see my brother wasn't like that, he didn't, and my father wasn't like that. I remember at Christmas time we'd get continental chocolates, and my father could have 2 chocolates, I remember that, and I couldn't. I just couldn't. I would, start eating the bottom layer before the top layer was done. And again, I couldn't keep away from it. So I've always been like that. And for me, what else happened with the way I am is that when I was 8 years old, we went on a big overseas trip on a ship to Australia and Fiji, and I made friends with some little Australian girls, and I remember it was something like somebody talked about your tummy sticking out, and I remember 8 years old in a bikini on the ship and pulling my tummy in. And that was the first time I became aware of my weight, and I was aware of it from then, and aware of it maybe when I was about 11, but when I was 16, I remember, we're living in Christchurch, and I remember looking in the mirror in my parents' bedroom. It was a full-length mirror, and looking at my ankles and thinking, oh, they're fat. And, I don't know how this happened, but between the fat ankles, I made a decision that I was going to go to Weight Watchers. And I went there for 6 weeks. And this again is another part of what I know about this disease of addiction that I have, is that I didn't tell anybody about this. The only person who knew was my mother. And I can't remember if my father knew or not. But anyway, I went to Weight Watchers, and I did it absolutely perfectly for 6 weeks. And then in the last week, I remember, because we'd be weighed every Monday, and I made this decision that I was going to get beyond my goal weight. And so for the whole weekend, I drank water and ate carrots. And on the Monday, I was queuing up to be weighed, and I got weighed. And a woman heard my weight, and she just said to me, did you starve yourself all weekend? And I didn't say anything, because I literally had. But that started me dieting. And I remember I went home that night after, I think I'd thought in my own mind that I'd get recognition, I'd get a badge, I'd get told how great I was for losing this weight, and none of that happened. And I went home, and I remember it was a winter night, it was Christchurch. My mother had hot soup on the stove, she was a really good cook, and I just went inside, and it's just like I turned into something else. I started eating the soup, I started eating chocolate biscuits, I just started eating whatever I could lay my hands on. And so here I had been for 6 weeks on this very careful, planned diet. Then I go home, and it was just the complete opposite. And I remember I went into our dining room, I put my hand on the table, and I was puffing, and I was going, because I just had this massive food frenzy. And I don't know, it was just such a contrast. I just remember that moment though. And when I look back now, what happened from then, so I was 16, is that I'm able to see now that I started this thing of, dieting, binging, and exercising. And so after I ate this huge colossal amount of food that night, in my mind I thought, I'll start again tomorrow. And so the next day, I remember I invited a mate round to my house after school, and I had some chocolate, and I remember giving it to her and saying, oh, no, not for me, thanks. So my next kind of recollection is I just remember being at university and, there was no dieting to begin with. And then one day I saw a photo of myself, and somebody had come up to me. It was a huge close-up. And I saw this photo, and I was really shocked, and I thought, God, I've got a fat face. And a friend of a friend, I started to talk to her about weight, and she said, "Oh, I go to aerobics," and I just thought, I'm going to go to aerobics, and that started, my next obsession, which was exercise. And so I started exercising down in Dunedin, and then when I left university, I went to Auckland and I got a job, and I would finish work and I would travel from one side of Auckland to the other to either go swimming, doing lots and lots of lengths, or going to a fitness class, or I would go for a run. And this was regardless of how tired I was, how much I had to do that night, I had to do that. And so that became a big part of my life, and that carried on wherever I lived in New Zealand. Always with me it was to lose weight. But also around this time in Auckland, I remember a few years passed and I was coming to the end of my time in this job, and I was teaching, and it was my last week in this school, and I had there was a lot on. I had a lot to do, and I found, for some reason or another, I've never had this before, since I couldn't eat. I remember I ate pizza all week and I only ate hardly anything, but it's just because I had a lot to do. But what that did to my mind is I realised, I could get away with not eating much. And so I went overseas for a few years, and there was a lot of drinking over there. There was a lot of drug taking. My eating was all over the place. But what I remember is when I came back, I ended up in a relationship, and that fell through after a period of time, and it was incredibly painful. It was just horrible. The person I'd been seeing was in my same workplace. And anyway, again, the same thing kind of happened. I couldn't eat, and then the pain passed, and I don't remember my thinking, but I just know that I started starving. And what I mean by that is I would hardly eat. And the way I'd do this was, in my job at the time, I would cook, and at dinner time, I would just be saying to work colleagues, I didn't say actually, I just didn't have dinner. And this is how crazy my thinking was. I thought that was perfectly normal. I just didn't eat dinner. And then one day, a young student in our workplace just said to another woman, I think Diana's got an eating disorder. And I found this out secondhand, and I remember being told this and saying nothing, because that's what I always did. I never said anything. But, this was all I thought at the time was I just wanted to be thin. And I would do things like I'd eat apples for a day. I would just really try not to eat. And I would go around to my mother's at the weekend, and she, to me, was a typical Kiwi mum. She'd always have a big roast dinner, like a chicken or meat or something. And I wouldn't be wanting it. And she would just be so furious with me. And I just wouldn't eat, And I found out later, so I was starving myself for the best part of a year before I came in here. And what I found out later is I had about 2 or 3 different groups of friends. And one of them was a flatmate, Maria, and we were at the time, we were all good time girls, always partying and drinking. And it was all kind of fun and frivolity. And one day she sat me down, and we were never really that serious, always quite light. And she just said to me, Di, I want to talk to you. And I remember thinking, what the hell does she want to talk to me about? And she looked at me and she just said, I'm really, really worried about you. And she may as well slap me in the face. I was just like, what the hell are you talking about? And she said, you are really thin. You are wasting away and you need to eat. And, again, I don't know what I said. I probably said nothing or, just said everything was fine. And the other thing I found out about is that she talked to some other friends of mine. So they weren't all friends, but they were talking about me to each other because they were so concerned. I think Maria rang my mother, and my mother used to ring her because I just wasn't eating, and I was completely oblivious. And things that I would do, it's like I remember once I went out to a cafe with a mate, Louise, and this cafe was kind of renowned for its huge muffins. And I remember ordering one of these muffins. So I don't remember a thing about Louise. I don't remember a thing about the conversation. But I just remember this muffin. And I remember I actually couldn't eat it. I could only eat about half. And, and I was obsessed. And I'd be like that all the time. I'd go out for dinner. And, to this day, I could tell you what I remember going out for dinner in Courtney Place. And I ordered this huge pasta meal. And the person I was with ordered something else. And I just remember being really angry because I had so much to eat, I was just always, food just ruled my mind and my life. Or I'd go out for dinner and then I'd have to go for a massive run the next day. So my starving, it was crazy. I remember I went out for dinner one night and I went to a movie. I had a glass of wine. I went to a cafe afterwards and I wasn't eating. And I remember I was so weak from not eating that I actually couldn't think properly. And I was with this person and I couldn't even think of what to say or how to hold a conversation because I didn't even have the strength. And this would happen to me a lot, I was always going out and again I remember I went out once and there was pizza and I could only eat like one tiny little triangle. My body actually couldn't handle anymore. It was just bizarre. So what happened for me is I ended up going to a treatment centre because I am an alcoholic as well and my drinking was completely out of control. And this treatment centre dealt with all addiction. And they were completely honest. And, I went there with a big smile on my face and knew that, my drinking was hell and I needed to stop that. And I absolutely was there for the drinking. But they realised very quickly that, my eating was wacko. And I was far too thin, though I wouldn't have thought that. And I do weird things. Like I remember a woman arrived who was also incredibly thin. I remember the first thing I said to her was, what do you eat? I was just, oh God, I was just crazy. And anyway, in this treatment centre, they absolutely didn't muck around. You were either there to get well and really take, the 12 Steps of AA seriously, or they didn't want to waste the time because it cost a lot of money and it was 6 weeks. And one day a counsellor wanted to meet with me and, I said, okay. And she just looked at me straight and said, you have got an eating problem and you need to go to this food fellowship. And I remember being shocked, horrified, angry, really not wanting to do what she said. But because I absolutely knew in my heart my drinking was horrendous and I didn't want to leave this treatment program, I said, I reluctantly said, okay, I'll go. And, you know, the night that this meeting was on, I couldn't even go in the door. I was just so terrified. I couldn't even go in the door. I remember I'd walk up to the side, walk away, walk up. And eventually I somehow got myself through that door. And what I remember is I really remember hope, and I really remember it was so amazing to hear people be so open about their eating. I had never, ever in my life heard anybody be so open about their eating, because what I know about my disease, my illness of addiction, is that, you know, my actual addictive nature is I'm really secretive. I don't talk about anything, but I make out everything's okay. And these women were just telling it as it was, you know. And I just remember at the end of the meeting just feeling wonderful, you know. It was just the honesty. But it didn't stop me. You know, I carried on eating, well, starving myself, and then came back to Wellington, and I came to a meeting in Wellington, and as I said, I'd been starving myself for over a year, but I also knew, for me, when I was going to binge, I actually used to feel it inside. It was like a volcano rising up. I always knew I could never stop my binges or control them, and I went to this meeting, and I felt a lot of hope, and I really enjoyed what people were saying, and they were saying, you know, get a sponsor, and I thought, yeah. But after that, I don't remember much. I know that I started eating, like full-on scale binging after that meeting. And so that was in like February of 1 year. And I didn't stop eating. This is like the starving left, the exercise left. I couldn't do it anymore. And I just ate full-scale binging every day from February of that year to December. And I was absolutely obsessed. The obsession was unbelievable. I got really, really depressed. I was big. I was unhappy. I was miserable. I wasn't talking about anything. But a couple of things happened in that year. One is I rang a young woman after I'd, you know, just eaten everything out of the kitchen almost, and I'd got her number from my AA sponsor, and I picked up the phone. I didn't know her, and I just said who I was, and I said to her, I've just been eating, and she said, oh, what have you eaten? And I couldn't tell her, and I was a few feet away from the kitchen, and she didn't miss a beat, and she just said, oh, you're on blackout. And I remember I actually got a tear. I knew a lot about blackout from my drinking, but not from my eating. I was so shocked. She suggested I call somebody else, and I did, and this lady had been in recovery for a long time. And again, I picked up the phone and said my name, and she just sounded really light, and she just talked. And I maybe I was starting to get desperate, because I wrote down everything she said. And I still remember what she said. And she said to me, the first thing she said to me is, she said, you're not a bad person. Because, and that amazed me. She didn't know me. And then she said, you know, what you've got is you've got this disease of addiction. And it'll take years. And it can take years and years and years and years and years. But it will kill you. And she said it does it 3 ways. It does it through obesity, anorexia, and suicide. And you've got to realise 2 things: that addictions swap, and to put down the food. And for me at that time, this is just me, but when she said the word suicide, you know, my thinking was so horrendous all the time that my suicidal thinking was a normal part of my mind. That's where I'd got to with my eating, and I wasn't even aware of it, you know, because I didn't talk about anything real. And when she said addiction swap, I completely related, because I'd stopped drinking and my eating had got worse. And I didn't actually understand what she meant by put down the food, but I've got a lot of pride, and I just carried on listening. And she just talked about herself, and she just said that it had taken her, a couple of years. Something like, she'd been like cold turkey for 2 years, but she hadn't picked up, and and she had a higher power in her life, and that was kind of the main things that I remember. So that was in the May, and my eating was just like free fall, downhill, getting worse. And in December of that year, I went out to a movie one night with a friend. She was in AA. She was going through a divorce. My self-centeredness and obsessive thinking was all about me. So she was going through hell, and I don't know where my mind was, but it wasn't on her. We'd had a nice time. We'd been to a cafe. We went to this movie, and, it was all a pleasant evening. And I just remember, it's like I got the heebie-jeebies in that movie. I can't even describe it, but something just completely came over me, and I couldn't sit still, and I just kept turning to Deirdre in the middle of this movie. And somewhere deep inside myself, I just knew that I could not carry on as I was. I just couldn't. And for the first time in my life ever, and this has never happened before or since, I had this absolutely horrendous, horrible, I can't even describe it, but it was the most horrendous thing. And it was, I'll put words to it now, but I couldn't then, and it's all over, it is all over. And then, I actually had in my mind an act of how I was going to take my own life. And, I'd always had the thinking, but not the action. And that scared it terrified me. And then at the same time, just into my mind came this thought, and it was, I'm going to ring this young woman. And it was the young woman who told me about blackout eating. And I thought, I'm going to ring her, And she had actually 12-stepped me previously. She'd travelled from Rotorua to Wellington to 12-step me, which is where she told me her story. And that in the next 24 hours, or even after that movie, I can't quite remember, but I rang her, and I just said to her, can you help me, And again, a really short conversation, and she just said, ring me tomorrow. And I rang her the next day, and my recollection is, I can't remember that phone call, but I just remember the next time I rang her, I wasn't binge eating. She'd talked to me about what to eat, and I started ringing her all the time, and she became my sponsor. And, I'm very, very grateful to this program, because I don't know where I'd be if I wasn't here. And, the absolute blessed fact is that today I don't have that constant thinking about what am I going to eat, when am I going to eat it, what's so-and-so going to think of me eating. It just never, ever stopped, my thinking about food. That has gone completely. The other thing I used to think is I always compared myself to others, and I always thought I was the only person in the world who did what I did with food, because I never talked about what I did openly and honestly. And now, I know lots of people like me in recovery who, are also not doing what they used to do with food, and so that obsession and compulsion has completely been lifted because of this program. And as I say, I'm very grateful.